Snoop Dogg pulls into the parking lot of Luxury Motors, the flagship dealership he's recently acquired in the bustling city of Sunville. The heat shimmers off the sleek, high-end vehicles parked out front, their glossy finishes practically glowing under the afternoon sun. He parks his modest SUV in an unmarked spot at the back of the lot, carefully observing the dealership's facade. Dressed in a simple grey hoodie, worn jeans, and sneakers, Snoop's look is far from what anyone would expect of the owner of such a luxurious establishment. As he walks inside, the chatter from the employees near the front desk quiets, their eyes flicking to his casual appearance, exchanging subtle glances. They have no idea who he is. Snoop isn't here to judge. He's here to observe, to see if the employees respect all customers, no matter how they look. In the sun-kissed city of Sunville, a quiet revolution was taking place inside the sleek showroom of Luxury Motors. The showroom, gleaming with high-end cars and polished floors, was the heart of a dealership that had long been synonymous with exclusivity and wealth. But on this particular morning, something was different, something no one could anticipate. Jake Lawson, the new owner of Luxury Motors, had decided to make his entrance in a way no one could have predicted. He pulled into the parking lot in his modest SUV, far removed from the extravagant vehicles that lined the front of the dealership. His decision to dress simply, wearing a grey hoodie, worn jeans, and sneakers, was not out of carelessness but out of a desire to experience the dealership for what it truly was. Behind the polished facade, he wanted to see how the business operated when no one knew the boss was watching. Jake took a deep breath as he stepped out of his SUV, his eyes scanning the dealership. He could hear the faint hum of laughter and casual chatter from inside. The glass doors of the showroom reflected the light as he made his way toward them. His presence, while calm, was a deliberate choice, a quiet challenge to the world of luxury that surrounded him. Inside, the employees, dressed in suits and professional attire, were gathered near the front desk. The moment Jake entered, their voices hushed, and eyes flicked in his direction, their gaze dismissive and tinged with curiosity. He could feel the shift in the air, the way the room seemed to assess him not for who he was, but for what he was wearing. It was a quiet judgment, but it stung. Among them was Elena, a sharp and ambitious manager, whose polished exterior betrayed little of the tension simmering beneath the surface. She was the first to approach him, clipboard in hand, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. "Excuse me." Elena's voice was cool, almost rehearsed. "Can I help you with something?" Jake smiled softly, his demeanor unbothered, calm. "Just here to look around." Elena raised an eyebrow, scanning his casual outfit. "Are you here for a car?" she asked, her tone carrying an edge of doubt. Jake nodded. "Something like that," he replied, his calmness in stark contrast to the subtle judgment she directed his way. He could tell she was sizing him up, assuming he wasn't her typical clientele. "Well," Elena continued, "we cater to a very specific type of customer here. Most of our inventory requires pre-qualification. Perhaps I could recommend another dealership?" Her words were carefully chosen, as though she was offering a lifeline to someone who clearly didn't belong. Jake paused, his gaze steady. "You are assuming I'm not qualified?" His voice was smooth, but there was an undeniable edge to the question. Elena faltered for just a moment, her expression tight. "I'm just trying to save you some time," she said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Jake's expression remained unchanged. He glanced around the showroom, his fingers brushing the door handle of a sleek, silver coupe. "Nice car," he said simply, his voice casual as he admired the vehicle's aggressive design. For a brief moment, Elena's smile wavered, but she quickly regained composure. It is, she agreed, though her words felt empty now. Perhaps when you're ready to make a serious inquiry, we can set up an appointment. For now, though, I'll have to ask you not to touch the vehicles. Jake stood still for a moment, absorbing her words. Finally, he stepped back from the car. All right, he said, let's hear it. What would you recommend for someone like me? Elena blinked in surprise at his directness. And for the first time, Jake saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She recovered quickly, her voice dropping just slightly in tone. Maybe something a little more budget-friendly? I can give you directions to a dealership that specializes in pre-owned vehicles. Jake's smile never faltered, but his eyes were cold now. The amusement only barely contained. That's quite the assumption, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Elena's composure cracked just a bit. She forced another smile, and her posture stiffened as she turned to leave. I'll be back with a list of options, she said briskly, and with that, she walked away. Jake stood in the middle of the showroom, his gaze drifting over the array of luxury vehicles. The quiet murmur of employees resumed, but Jake could feel the weight of their stares. He didn't mind. He wasn't here for their approval. He wasn't here to be judged by anyone, especially not by someone who hadn't even bothered to see him for who he really was. Minutes passed before Elena returned. Her clipboard clutched tightly, her every movement betraying her annoyance. She handed Jake a list of vehicles, each far below the dealership's typical offerings, with prices that seemed more suited to the used car lot down the street. These are more accessible models, she said, her tone almost condescending. Reliable, economical, and practical. Jake took the list without a word, scanning the vehicles listed. Used sedans, old SUVs, a compact hybrid, all priced far below the sleek, high-end machines on the showroom floor. A faint smile tugged at his lips, but he quickly masked it, folding the paper and tucking it into his pocket. I appreciate the effort, he said simply. Elena's eyes narrowed. Listen, she said, lowering her voice slightly. I've been doing this for a long time. I know when someone's out of their depth. Luxury motors isn't for everyone. Jake raised an eyebrow. Out of my depth, he repeated, the words almost thoughtful as they left his mouth. Interesting. Her gaze faltered for a brief second, but she pressed on, her tone becoming more forceful. I'm just being realistic with you. Luxury motors isn't for everyone, and I don't want to waste your time. Jake met her gaze. His expression was calm, but there was a new edge to his voice. How about this? He said, his voice firm. You let me speak to the owner. Think we can make that happen? Elena's eyebrows shot up. For the first time, she seemed genuinely caught off guard. The owner? She asked, her voice faltering. That's not possible today. The owner doesn't just drop by for casual visits. Jake nodded slowly. I'm sure they don't, but maybe you could give them a call and let them know I'm here. I think they'd want to meet me. Elena's frustration was barely concealed now, her smile tight and forced. I've got other customers to attend to. If you're serious about buying, we can schedule an appointment with one of our sales consultants. Otherwise, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. The words were sharp, final. Jake felt the tension rise, but he didn't flinch. Well, he said slowly, I think I'll make the call myself. With that, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts with calm precision. Elena's confident facade faltered, her eyes narrowing as she watched him. Jake dialed the number, lifting the phone to his ear. Yeah, it's me. I'm at the dealership. Everything's fine. Just a little misunderstanding. Could you let them know I'm here? The room fell silent as Jake made the call. The employees watching, their eyes wide with curiosity. The tension was thick, and for a moment, no one moved. After a few moments, Jake ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He turned back to Elena, his voice as casual as ever. "They'll be here shortly." Elena's face went pale as realization set in. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "Who did you just call?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake didn't answer right away. He glanced around at the employees who had stopped what they were doing, their attention fixed on the unfolding scene. "Guess we'll find out," he said, his voice almost playful. The tension in the room was palpable. Jake stood by one of the luxury SUVs, his calm demeanor only adding to the unease in the showroom. Minutes passed, and then, the sound of the main doors opening broke the silence. A sharply dressed man in a navy suit stepped inside. His polished shoes clicked softly on the tile floor. His expression was serious but warm. "Mr. Lawson," the man said with a wide smile, extending his hand as he approached Jake. "So good to see you." Jake returned the handshake firmly. "Thanks for coming, Vince. Appreciate it." The room collectively stiffened. Elena's clipboard nearly slipped from her hands, her eyes darting between Jake and Vince, her confusion turning to alarm. "Wait." Elena's voice trembled. "Mr. Lawson?" Vince turned to her, his demeanor shifting into something more professional. "Elena, I see you've already met Mr. Lawson," he said sharply. "He's the new owner of this dealership." Elena's face went ashen. She took a step back, her eyes wide with realization. I didn't realize," she stammered. Jake's voice was calm, but firm. "It's fine, Elena," he said, his gaze steady as he watched her. "I think we just got off on the wrong foot." The tension in the room was thick. Everyone was watching, waiting for what would come next. The hum of quiet murmurs settled over the showroom like a dense fog as Jake Lawson stood there, his eyes still locked with Elena's. The tension between them was thick, almost palpable. For Elena, the realization had hit with a force she couldn't ignore. Jake Lawson, the man she'd just dismissed so casually, was no ordinary customer. He was the new owner of Luxury Motors, and now, her once confident demeanor seemed to shatter with every second that passed. She tried to regain control of her breath, her hands fidgeting with the clipboard as she took a cautious step back. Her mind raced, her usual sharpness nowhere to be found. The room seemed to hold its breath, everyone waiting for what would happen next. The employees who had been so quick to judge Jake now whispered among themselves, their eyes darting nervously from him to each other. "Mr. Lawson." Vince's voice broke through the tense silence, his tone warm yet authoritative. He stepped forward, his tailored suit sharp against the showroom's polished floors. Vince was the regional director of Luxury Motors, a man who had been with the company for years, well versed in its inner workings. But even he seemed to be taken aback by Jake's casual yet commanding presence. Jake's gaze shifted to Vince, and he offered a small, knowing smile. "Thanks for coming, Vince. I appreciate you making the time." Vince gave a slight nod, his eyes flicking briefly toward Elena before turning back to Jake. "Of course, Mr. Lawson. We're happy to have you here. Let's talk in my office." But Jake didn't move. Instead, he took a deliberate pause, glancing around the showroom once more. He could feel the eyes of the staff on him, their silent judgment hanging in the air. It wasn't the first time he'd been underestimated. But there was something about this moment, something about the way they had assumed so much about him based on nothing but his appearance, that stung more than usual. He knew the game they were playing. He knew the way people judged, assumed, and dismissed based on the most superficial of details. I think, Jake said, his voice cutting through the thick silence, that we should have this conversation right here, in front of everyone. Vince raised an eyebrow, glancing toward the employees who were now watching them closely. Are you sure? We can talk in private. Jake shook his head, his smile tight. No, I think it's important everyone hears this, including Elena. There was a brief moment of hesitation in the room, the air charged with uncertainty. Elena, still standing at the edge of the showroom, shifted uncomfortably. She could feel the eyes on her now, their unspoken judgment mingling with her own rising guilt. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected the simple, casual man she'd dismissed to be the person with the power to change everything around her. Her mind raced, trying to think of a way to salvage the situation. But every option seemed to slip away as she watched Jake's calm demeanor and the quiet authority that emanated from him. Finally, Vince sighed, the corners of his lips tightening as he looked at the employees. All right then, he said, his voice carrying a hint of reluctant compliance. Gather around, everyone. It seems we're going to have a bit of a meeting. The employees shuffled uneasily, some exchanging quick glances with each other. Elena remained where she stood, her posture stiff, her eyes glued to the floor. As the staff slowly gathered around, Jake moved to the center of the room, his hands in his pockets. His casual stance was a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere that surrounded him. The gleaming luxury vehicles that filled the showroom suddenly felt far less important in that moment. It was clear that something much bigger was unfolding here. Jake cleared his throat, his voice steady as he addressed the gathered staff. Thank you all for taking the time to join us. I know this is a little unconventional, he said, his eyes scanning the room. But there's something that needs to be addressed. Something I've noticed since I walked in. Elena shifted again, the nervous energy in her body impossible to suppress. She had no idea what was coming next. But she could already feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The others remained silent, the quiet murmurs from before replaced by an uneasy stillness. Everyone was watching, waiting. Jake's eyes flicked toward Elena, his expression unreadable. Earlier today, he began, I walked into this showroom, dressed like someone you wouldn't typically expect to be here. I wanted to see how this place operates when no one knows who's watching. I wanted to see how the staff treats people when they're not worried about impressing the boss. He paused, letting his words settle in the room. The employees were quiet now, each of them unsure how to react to this unexpected twist. What I saw, Jake continued, his voice gaining strength, was disappointing. I saw someone, Elena, assume I didn't belong here. Not because of anything I said or did, but because of how I looked. I saw her assume I wasn't qualified to be a customer here, simply because I wasn't wearing a suit. Elena's face flushed a deep red as Jake's words sank in. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, the shame flooding in as the reality of her actions hit her full force. She had assumed, she had judged, and now she was being called out for it in front of everyone. But Jake's voice softened just slightly, though it still held weight. This isn't just about you, Elena. It's about the culture here. It's about the way people are treated when they don't fit the mold. It's about the assumptions we make based on appearances, and how dangerous that can be. There was a long silence, the weight of Jake's words hanging heavily in the air. Elena opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She felt as though the room was closing in on her, her pulse racing in her ears. Jake let the silence stretch for a moment longer before he turned to address the rest of the staff. I'm not here to humiliate anyone. I'm not here to make anyone feel small. But I do want to make something very clear. From this day forward, there will be no room for assumptions here. There will be no room for judgment based on what people wear, how they look, or where they come from. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of every employee. We're not just selling cars here. We're building relationships. We're creating an experience for people. And that experience is built on respect. Respect for every person who walks through that door. Regardless of their background, their appearance, or anything else. The room was quiet. The employees seemed to be absorbing his words. Some nodding in agreement, others still unsure. Jake could see the shift happening before his eyes. They were listening, really listening, to what he was saying. From now on, Jake continued, his tone firm but encouraging. We're going to implement new training programs. We're going to focus on creating an environment where every customer, regardless of their appearance or what they wear, feels welcomed and valued. No exceptions. Vince, who had been standing quietly by the door, finally spoke up. I think that's a great idea. Mr. Lawson, we can start making the necessary changes immediately. Jake nodded, then turned back to Elena, his expression softening just slightly. Elena, you've been with this company for a long time, right? You've worked hard to get where you are. I respect that, but today was a wake-up call for all of us. I'm giving you the chance to make this right. I'm giving you the chance to learn, to grow, and to be part of something better. Elena swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. She finally managed to speak, her voice shaky but sincere. I was wrong, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I misjudged you, and for that, I'm truly sorry. Jake gave her a small, encouraging smile. Thank you for saying that. Change isn't easy, but it starts with accountability. And I'm willing to give you that chance. He turned back to the group, his expression resolute. I expect nothing less than the best from each of you. This is the standard we are going to set here. And I'm counting on all of you to help me lead the way. The employees were silent for a moment, taking in the gravity of what Jake had just said. And for the first time since he'd stepped foot into luxury motors, the tension in the room seemed to dissipate. The staff was no longer just following orders, they were beginning to believe in what Jake was saying. The following days after Jake's impromptu meeting in the showroom were tense. But there was a sense of something shifting in the air. The employees had gone back to their routines. But Jake knew that everything had changed. Even if it wasn't obvious yet. He could feel the undercurrent of doubt and fear among the staff, fear that things would be different now. That expectations had shifted, and that they might not be ready for it. But more than anything, Jake could sense a quiet anticipation. Change, like the heavy scent of rain before a storm, was in the air. It was coming. Jake had always been a man of action. And he didn't like to wait around for change to happen on its own. He wanted to drive it, to force it into existence. And so, he spent the next few days walking the showroom floor, observing the staff closely, every movement, every glance, every whisper. He wanted to see if they would rise to the challenge or if they would fall back into old habits. He wanted to see if Elena would redeem herself, if the others would follow her lead, or if they would resist. And in the midst of it all, there was one thing Jake knew for certain: he had to push them harder. This couldn't just be about words. He needed action. It was on the third day after the meeting that Jake called a mandatory team building event. The staff was told to arrive early for a special training session. He didn't give them many details. And he didn't have to. There was an air of intrigue mixed with dread that rippled through the group as they arrived. None of them quite sure what to expect. It wasn't the typical corporate training session that involved a PowerPoint presentation or a motivational speaker. No, Jake had something else in mind. Elena arrived first. As expected, her expression cautious but determined. The shift in her behavior was subtle but noticeable. She was more aware of her tone, more deliberate in her movements. Her usual polished exterior had cracked, and now there was a sense of vulnerability underneath. She had apologized for her actions in the meeting, but Jake could see the doubt lingering in her eyes. She wasn't sure if she was truly forgiven or if she was just being given a second chance out of necessity. Jake hadn't decided yet, but he was watching closely. He wasn't going to make it easy for her. Soon, the rest of the staff trickled in, each one wearing a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Jake waited for them in the showroom, standing by one of the luxury SUVs, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. The showroom, usually gleaming and pristine, now felt colder somehow. The shiny cars didn't seem as impressive anymore, not with the tension that had settled in the room. When everyone was gathered, Jake stepped forward, his voice commanding their attention immediately. "Good morning, everyone. I hope you are all ready for something a little different today." There was a murmur of uncertainty, but no one interrupted. Jake had made it clear the previous days that his authority was to be respected, and everyone in the room understood that. Elena stood at the back, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes fixed on the ground. Jake continued, "As I said in our last meeting, we are going to build a new culture here, one based on respect, fairness, and understanding. But I can't do this alone. You all have to be a part of it. And that means we need to confront some uncomfortable truths." Elena's gaze flickered briefly to Jake. There was something different about him now, something more commanding. The earlier kindness she had seen in him seemed to have faded, replaced by something more intense, more purposeful. She wasn't sure if she was ready for what was coming next. "Today," Jake said, his voice cool, "we're going to start with something simple. We're going to test the assumptions we've been making about each other, about our customers, about ourselves." There was a shift in the room. A collective breath seemed to be held. Jake could see it in their faces. They didn't know whether to be excited or terrified. He watched their expressions carefully, analyzing the flickers of uncertainty and suspicion. He knew that they thought this would be another corporate exercise, something to appease the new boss, something that would be forgotten by the next week. But Jake had a different plan in mind. "Each of you will be assigned a task today," Jake continued, his tone unwavering. "But I won't be the one giving out the assignments. I want you to pick your partners. Choose someone you don't usually work with, someone who might make you uncomfortable, someone who you've maybe overlooked in the past. And then, you'll complete the task together." A hushed murmur ran through the staff. The idea of working with someone they didn't know well, or worse, someone they had judged, made them uncomfortable. They weren't used to breaking down those walls. Not in a high-pressure environment like this. They had always stuck with their usual teams, their usual roles, their usual assumptions. Jake didn't give them time to overthink it. "Go ahead. Choose your partners." For a moment, there was hesitation. Then, slowly, people began to pair up. Elena, ever the professional, moved to join one of the younger employees. Chris, a sales associate who had only recently joined the team. He had always seemed quiet, reserved, and somewhat unsure of himself. Elena, by contrast, had always been the confident, polished figure in the room. She wasn't sure what had prompted her to pick him. Maybe it was the challenge of working with someone who was so different from herself. Someone who had yet to prove his worth. Or maybe it was the pressure of the situation. Either way, they were now partners. Jake watched them all carefully, noting how they moved, how they interacted. The tension was still there, but now it was tinged with something else, something like nervous excitement. Like they were about to be tested in a way they hadn't been before. As the pairs began their tasks, Jake could feel the room shift. Conversations that had been forced or awkward now felt a little more real. People were sharing more, learning more about each other. Elena and Chris, to Jake's surprise, seemed to be working well together. She was being more patient with him than she'd ever been with anyone. And he was stepping up to the challenge. There was a quiet dynamic shift between them. She had to let go of her usual control. And he had to rise to the occasion. They both knew it, but not everyone was as successful. A few of the other pairs were struggling. There was still a lot of resistance. A lot of people trying to hide behind their polished facades and comfort zones. Jake wasn't surprised. Change was hard, and it was going to take more than one exercise to break the ingrained patterns of behavior that had been formed over years. Midway through the day, Jake called everyone together for a quick debrief. The showroom was buzzing with quiet conversations as the staff gathered around him once more. Elena and Chris stood near the front, their expressions thoughtful but a little more relaxed than before. Jake's eyes scanned the group. "How do we feel?" he asked, his voice steady but probing. There was a brief silence before Chris spoke up, his voice hesitant but sincere. "I think I learned that I've been judging people a lot more than I realized," he admitted. "I've been assuming things about people's experience, about how they work, and I guess I've been wrong." Jake nodded, his gaze turning to Elena. She hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice quieter than usual. "I think I've learned the same thing," she said slowly. I've always prided myself on being able to tell who fits here and who doesn't. But today, I saw that I've been looking at people the wrong way. I've been judging them based on what they wear, how they act, what I think I know about them. But I didn't know them at all. There was a murmur of agreement from the rest of the group. Jake watched them closely, sensing a shift. Elena, once the epitome of polished professionalism, was beginning to let down her guard, her realization dawning on her. Jake smiled faintly, his eyes moving over the room. "Good," he said simply. "This is the beginning, but we're not done yet." The room was silent, the weight of Jake's words settling over everyone. It was clear now that the changes were just beginning, and they weren't going to be easy. But for the first time, it seemed that the staff was ready to rise to the challenge. And Jake Lawson knew that the storm had only just begun. The days following the team building exercise were a mixture of progress and uncertainty. Jake could feel the shift within his team, a subtle but undeniable change in the air. The employees were starting to engage more with each other, breaking down the walls they had built over years of assumptions and judgment. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Jake had been pushing them hard, setting high expectations that had made some of them uncomfortable. But discomfort was what led to growth, he reminded himself. And if they wanted to succeed, if Luxury Motors was going to live up to its potential, they had to be willing to push past their limits. The showroom still felt different, but Jake wasn't sure if it was the new energy or the tension that still lingered beneath the surface. Elena had come a long way, but there were times when Jake still caught her slipping into old habits. She was trying, he could see that, but change, true change, took time and trust. And trust was something that had to be earned, not simply expected. On the fourth day after the team building session, Jake decided to throw another curveball. He called a surprise meeting with the entire staff. He didn't give them any details, only told them to gather in the conference room in 20 minutes. The employees were uneasy, not knowing what to expect. The air was thick with whispers and speculation as they filed into the conference room. Elena was already there, sitting at the head of the long glass table, her fingers nervously drumming against the polished surface. She was deep in thought, but even she couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming. When everyone had taken their seats, Jake walked in. His presence was immediate, commanding the room in a way that made even the most seasoned employees sit a little straighter. His expression was unreadable as he stood at the front of the room, his gaze sweeping over the group. "Thank you for joining me on short notice," Jake began, his voice smooth but firm. "Today is going to be different. You're all here because I'm giving you one last test. A test not just of your skills, but of your character. I need to know that you are truly ready to change, not just for the company, but for yourselves." The room was quiet, every eye trained on Jake. He could feel the tension building. They were nervous, but that was exactly what he wanted. They needed to understand that the stakes were high, that they weren't just changing for the sake of it, they were changing to survive. Jake paced slowly in front of the group, his footsteps echoing in the room. "You've all had time to reflect on the assumptions you've made, on the judgments you've passed, and you've been given a chance to prove yourselves. But I'm not convinced yet." Elena's heart raced as she listened to Jake's words. She knew she had come a long way, but she couldn't help the nagging doubt that lingered in the back of her mind. What if she wasn't good enough? What if the old habits she tried to break were too deeply ingrained? Jake paused, locking eyes with each person in the room. "Here's the challenge. I'm going to assign each of you a real customer. Someone who doesn't fit the mold of our typical clientele. Someone who will challenge your assumptions and force you to confront your biases head on. You won't know anything about them beforehand. You won't know what they look like, how much money they make, or where they come from. All you'll know is that they're here, and they need your help." The employees exchanged uneasy glances. Jake could see the hesitation in their eyes, the fear of being exposed, the fear of failing. This was no longer just a corporate exercise. This was real, and the customers weren't just random people. They were carefully chosen to test the staff's ability to adapt to the new standards of inclusivity and respect that Jake was pushing for. Jake stood still for a moment, letting his words sink in. "You will be expected to treat these customers the same way you would treat the wealthiest, most influential person who walks through these doors. You will not assume anything about them. You will treat them with the same respect, the same attention, and the same level of service. I don't care if they're wearing a suit or if they're in a hoodie and sneakers. This is about respect, and if you can't manage that, then we have a bigger problem than I thought." He watched them carefully, his gaze unwavering. Elena was tense, her hands clenched into fists on the table in front of her. She had faced challenges before, but this was different. She knew the stakes were higher now. She knew Jake wasn't going to let them slide. One by one, Jake called up the staff, assigning them their customers. Elena's name was called last, and she stood up reluctantly, meeting Jake's eyes. Her breath caught in her throat as he handed her a piece of paper with the details of her assigned customer. "This is your test, Elena," Jake said quietly. His voice was softer now, but there was an undeniable firmness in it. "I expect you to prove to me, and to yourself, that you can rise above the assumptions. No more mistakes." Elena nodded, a mix of fear and determination washing over her. She had to do this, not just for Jake, but for herself. She had to prove that she was capable of change, that she could be the leader she had always strived to be. The customer was a middle-aged man named Victor, who, according to the brief, was there to inquire about a used car. Elena had no idea what kind of man Victor was, or what his story was. But that was the point. She wasn't supposed to make assumptions. She wasn't supposed to judge him. As Elena made her way out to the showroom to meet Victor, the other employees went about their assignments, each one walking a fine line between anxiety and resolve. Jake watched them closely from the sidelines, observing their interactions with the customers, their body language, and their behavior. He was looking for the smallest signs of progress, the subtle changes that would show him whether his efforts were working. Elena found Victor near the back of the showroom, standing next to a pre-owned sedan. He was wearing a simple denim jacket and a baseball cap, and at first glance, he didn't fit the typical luxury car buyer mold. Elena's first instinct was to dismiss him, but she caught herself just in time. She remembered Jake's words. She was here to treat him with respect. No assumptions. "Hello, sir," she said, her voice steady but warm. "Can I help you with something today?" Victor turned to face her, his expression neutral but not unfriendly. "Just looking," he said, his tone casual. "I'm in the market for something practical, something reliable." Elena smiled, pushing aside her initial doubts. "Of course, we have a variety of pre-owned vehicles that might suit your needs. Would you like to take a look?" As they moved through the dealership, Elena found herself listening more closely to Victor, asking questions about his preferences, his needs. He wasn't like the high-profile clients she was used to, but there was something about him that made her want to help him find exactly what he needed. She had expected to feel uneasy, to be unsure of herself. But as she listened to Victor's story, she realized something. He wasn't that different from the clients she had worked with before. He was just a person, with his own needs and desires. He deserved the same respect, the same attention, as anyone else who walked through those doors. By the end of the meeting, Elena was no longer focused on the assumptions she had once carried. She was focused on providing the best possible service, on helping Victor find the right car. And when he left, his hand shaking slightly as he handed her a business card, Elena felt a sense of accomplishment. She had passed the test, not because she had sold him a car, but because she had treated him as an equal, without judgment. As Elena returned to the conference room to debrief with Jake and the rest of the team, she felt a shift inside her. This wasn't just about the customers. It was about her. It was about realizing that change didn't happen overnight, but it started with small, everyday actions. And today, she had made the right choice. Jake watched her as she walked in, his expression unreadable, but he knew she had passed the test. And so had the others. The days after the customer assignments were a whirlwind of activity. The showroom buzzed with a new energy, one that Jake hadn't seen before. The staff seemed different, more engaged, more attentive, and more present. There was no longer a sense of hesitation in their movements. They were working as a team, not just because Jake had forced them to, but because they had started to believe in what he was trying to create. Elena, in particular, had undergone a noticeable transformation. After her successful interaction with Victor, she had begun to carry herself differently. There was a quiet confidence in the way she moved through the showroom, in the way she spoke to her colleagues and customers. She had finally embraced the change, not as something forced upon her, but as something she genuinely wanted to be part of. But Jake knew that one test was never enough. Change wasn't something that could be measured in a single moment. It was a process, a long, ongoing journey. And though he had seen the improvements, he was still wary. He needed to ensure that the lessons they had learned would stick. That they would continue to apply these new values in every interaction they had. Every customer they served. It was late in the afternoon when Jake called the staff together for one final meeting. This time, there was no tension in the air, no unease. The employees had come to understand that Jake's leadership wasn't about control, it was about growth. It was about creating a culture where respect and inclusion were at the forefront. They had bought into it. And now it was time to see if they could truly make it their own. Elena was the first to arrive, her face bright with a sense of accomplishment. She had come a long way, and she knew it, but there was still something in her that held her back from fully believing that she could be the kind of leader Jake was asking her to be. The other employees began to trickle in, exchanging quick greetings, but the excitement was palpable. They were ready to see where this journey would take them next. Jake stood at the front of the room, his arms crossed, watching them closely. He had a quiet, confident air about him, but there was something else in his eyes, something deeper. A kind of pride, but also an expectation. This was the moment of truth. "I'm proud of all of you," Jake began, his voice steady and calm. "You've come a long way since that first meeting. The progress you've made in such a short time is impressive. You've proven to me that you're willing to put in the work. You've shown that you're capable of changing, of growing. And I want to congratulate you for that." The staff exchanged glances, unsure of what was coming next. Jake continued, "But the work isn't over. Change doesn't just happen overnight. It doesn't just happen because we want it to. It happens because we keep pushing. Because we keep challenging ourselves to be better." He paused, letting his words sink in. Elena watched him carefully, her expression thoughtful. She had grown, but she knew there was still more to do. Jake's gaze shifted to her, meeting her eyes for a brief moment. It was the first time she had ever seen him look at her like that, like he believed in her. "Today," Jake said, his tone shifting, "I'm asking you all to take one final step. I want you to step out of your comfort zones. I want you to put everything you've learned into action. And I want you to do it in front of me. Today is not about selling cars. Today is about showing me, and yourselves, that you've truly changed." There was a murmur of confusion among the staff. Jake smiled, sensing their curiosity. "Here's what we are going to do. You are going to pair up, just like before. And this time, I'm going to be one of the customers. I'm going to walk through this showroom like a stranger. And I want to see how you treat me." The room fell silent. It wasn't what they had expected. They had prepared for another corporate exercise, another training session. But this was different. This was real. Jake could feel the tension rise. He watched as the staff exchanged nervous glances, their excitement from earlier replaced by apprehension. They had learned the lessons. But this test was a different kind of challenge. This time, the stakes were personal. Jake knew that this would be the moment that determined if their transformation had truly taken root. "I'm going to be watching you," Jake said, his voice firm but encouraging. "I want to see how you treat me, not as the boss, but as a customer. I want to see if you've internalized everything we've talked about. If you can treat every person, regardless of who they are or what they look like, with the same respect and care." There was a brief moment of stillness before the staff began to pair up again. Elena looked at Chris, the young sales associate she had worked with earlier. Their eyes met, and for the first time, she didn't hesitate. She walked toward him, her confidence evident. "Let's do this," she said, her voice steady. Chris gave her a small nod, and together, they moved toward the showroom floor, ready to face the challenge ahead. Elena's heart raced in her chest. But as she looked at Chris, She realized that this was it. This was her moment to prove that she had truly changed. That she was ready to be the kind of leader Jake believed she could be. Jake walked into the showroom shortly after. Dressed in a plain hoodie and jeans, his typical attire when he wanted to blend in. He moved through the rows of luxury cars, glancing at the vehicles as if he were a typical customer. Just another stranger walking through the doors. As he passed by the first few employees, he could see their eyes flicking to him, sizing him up. There were subtle glances exchanged, but no one approached him. Elena watched from across the showroom, her heart in her throat. This was her moment to show that she had learned the lessons, that she had internalized everything Jake had taught her. Finally, Elena and Chris approached Jake, their steps measured and confident. Elena's eyes met his, and for the first time, she didn't see him as the boss. She saw him as a customer, someone she needed to treat with the same respect and attention as anyone else who walked through those doors. "Can I help you, sir?" Elena asked, her voice steady, her smile warm but professional. Jake turned to face her, his expression neutral. "I'm just looking," he replied casually. "I'm interested in a car, but I don't know what I want yet." Elena nodded, her posture straightening. "Of course, we have a variety of vehicles here. What are you looking for?" Jake could feel her sincerity, her focus. She was treating him like any other customer. But there was something more to it. Something different. Elena was fully present, fully engaged. She wasn't trying to impress him, she was trying to help him. The conversation continued, and Jake watched as Elena and Chris worked together seamlessly, asking the right questions, listening intently, and offering helpful suggestions. It wasn't just about the cars anymore, it was about the experience, about the genuine care they were offering. By the end of the interaction, Jake was satisfied. He had seen enough. Elena and Chris had passed the test, and so had the rest of the team. They had proven that they were ready for the next chapter, not just for the dealership, but for themselves. As the employees gathered for one final debrief, Jake stood at the front of the room, his eyes scanning the group. "You've all done well," he said, his voice steady and calm. "You've proven that you can change, that you can grow, and I'm proud of you. But remember, this isn't the end. This is just the beginning. You have to keep pushing. Keep challenging yourselves. Keep learning." Elena stood at the back of the room, her heart swelling with pride. She had come so far. She had faced her doubts, her fears, and had pushed through them. She wasn't the same person who had walked into luxury motors all those months ago. And now, she was ready to lead. Jake gave her a knowing smile. And for the first time, she truly believed that she had earned his respect. The transformation was complete.